This is the Board Hawk Podcast. I'm Alan Gottlieb.
And I'm Alexis Menocal Harrigan. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Board Hawk Podcast. Today, it's just Alan and I, but we have a lot to talk about. We were both fortunate to be able to attend a recent meeting that DPS staff held on the redrawing district boundaries. There were two district meetings that took place this past week, one on Thursday night and one on Friday morning at 7:30 a.m. Kudos to the parents that were able to do the 7:30 a.m. call, especially with school drop-offs around that time for elementary students. So we want to talk about that meeting. We want to talk about what DPS is planning on doing over the next 6 months or so when it comes to redrawing district boundaries. This is a highly political topic that has a lot of history, which I'm so excited Alan has been a reporter in Denver as long as he has, because he will be able to provide some of that context here in a little bit. And would love for our listeners to hear some of your stories, Alan, that I've been fortunate enough to hear about the last time that we were redrawing maps in the city. So before we do that, though, let's talk a little bit about the timeline, what exactly it is we're talking about, and who is making the decision when it comes to redrawing district boundaries. And Alan, feel free to interrupt me at any point here. So to start, what we're talking about specifically is school boundaries and enrollment zones. When we say school boundaries, most schools, but not all, in Denver have a geographic boundary where the students in that boundary are guaranteed a seat. If you live within that boundary, you're guaranteed a seat in that school. Then if that school doesn't have enough students or seats, there is a preference or sometimes a lottery, but usually some sort of preference for students who can enter that school. Oftentimes, if you're a student of a staff member of the school, for example, you would get preference, or if you have a sibling at that school already, you would get preference. But there are different types of schools that have different types of boundaries. So, for example, there are choice-only schools, and that's a school where there is no geographic boundary. That's a DSST school that my child happens to go to for middle school. There are magnet schools where you have to get in through application process, think DSA. There are academic
DSA being Denver School of the Arts.
Thank you so much. Denver School of the Arts, not Democratic Socialist of America. But that would be an interesting school. And I bet in Denver, we would get some good enrollment in that. There is magnet schools like Polaris and Maury, where highly gifted students are eligible to attend that school and they are given preference. Polaris being one where it's 100% highly gifted students. Maury being one where it's 2 programs within a school. What else am I missing, Alan? Oh, and then there's zones.
Enrollment zones, right?
Yep.
Exactly.
So enrollment zones, very popular in the far northeast and northeast part of the city. Those are zones where you have the ability to choose your preference within that zone, and you are guaranteed a spot in the zone, but that doesn't necessarily mean you are guaranteed a seat in the school that is closest to you, even if that's your preference. So
and the idea behind that just is, I think this happened under Tom Boasberg, and the idea behind it was that if you broaden out the area that people are drawn from, it increases the possibility, at least, of having schools that are more socioeconomically and racially integrated.
That's exactly right. So you have zones that include Green Valley Ranch and Gateway, and I can't remember if Central Park is included in that, but there are zones that are drawn in a way that you do have different socioeconomic neighborhoods and race ethnicity concentrations as well. So you might be interested, and the critique of that is that you may live across the street from a school, you love that school, you moved into the neighborhood because of that school, but then you are not guaranteed a seat in that school, you're guaranteed a seat in the boundary. The benefit is that one of the challenges with choice is that we don't have equitable busing across the district, meaning if you choose to send your kid to a school outside of the boundary, you don't get busing. However, in the zones, there is busing, and I think it's called like School Bus Express or Success Express.
The Success Express, yeah.
Success Express. So that means that, if you're a parent without the ability or don't want to drive your kid to school in the morning or can't for some reason, then there's busing to get your child to that school. Okay, that was a lot of in the weeds, but I think it's important context that not every school has the same policy, boundary, or even ability to choice into. And I think it's just worth noting that those are the types of complexities that the district and the superintendent and the board will likely face when it comes to some of these community meetings. And parents are going to be hyper interested in what this means for their specific case, their specific student, their specific school, which is why, as a parent, I asked, or I made a comment in the community meeting about, are you thinking about changing or reviewing choice only schools? Because my argument is choice only schools are some of the most integrated, both racially and socioeconomically. So that's the first piece. The second piece,
And I want to stop you just for a second
please.
there, if I could, Alexis, because
Go ahead.
you mentioned the DSST school your child goes to, but are there choice? I actually don't know the answer to this. This is why I'm asking. Are there choice only schools that aren't charters that are district run that are choice only?
Yes, but they are magnet.
Yeah, right. So you have their criteria to get in, like highly gifted,
Right.
or you have to audition to get into the Denver School of the Arts, et cetera.
Exactly. I don't, and I hope somebody will, I know somebody will correct us if we're wrong, but I cannot think of a single non-charter, non-magnet school that is choice only. And I know a lot of the schools.
Yeah. I can't off the top of my head.
It's a great question.
We'll get corrected really quickly. So.
Yes, we will. And that's what we love about our listeners.
Right.
Let's see what else. Oh, okay. So a couple of other things. Because I'm that person, if you all don't know that already, I took screenshots of every single slide. And kudos to Andrew Huber and team who ran that meeting. I've said this before. The process 2 years ago where the DPS staff, and I think led by Andrew over there, that they did on the DPS Thriving Schools Initiative. Again, I might be getting the name wrong. I was so impressed by the thoughtfulness, the community engagement, the data-informed presentations that went to both community members and the board. I am hopeful that because we have some of the same staff members that led that process on this process, that there will be transparency, that there will be data-informed presentations. I hope that also translates to data-informed decision-making. And we have been told that the intent is to try and create more integrated schools within the district. So time will tell if that actually happens. The challenge, of course, and we'll get into this part of the discussion, is that the city is segregated. The reality is we live in a very segregated city, neighborhood by neighborhood. Okay.
And I think an interesting, I'm sorry.
No,
But an interesting subset of the segregation of the city is that despite the fact that only maybe a quarter of the kids in Denver public schools are white, there are a handful of schools that are heavily concentrated with white students, which means that the white students are very unevenly distributed, and that in a segregated city, it would take a lot of, for lack of a better term, gerrymandering to figure out a way to get the schools integrated when the city is so segregated. And the Slavenses and Brownwells and some other schools like that of the world, Steele in my neighborhood, are very heavily concentrated with the white students in the district. Now I'm talking about elementary schools here.
Right. And I think elementary is where you're going to see the biggest concentration because my assumption, and I don't know if my assumption is that you're going to see less choice out in elementary and much more in middle school and high school as well. Okay, a couple last things. And Alan and I said, maybe we'll do 30 minutes. That's not going to happen, Alan. I can tell you right now. Part of the other reason that they're doing this is declining enrollment. Y'all know that. We don't need to get into that right now. And then as far as timeline and process, I think it's important to share with folks. This past week, DPS held 2 virtual meetings, as we mentioned. They are in the process of doing internal planning, developing and reviewing analytical models. My favorite is the strategic regional analysis, which is a very dense, like 100-page, sometimes 100-page plus slide deck that has details for every region in the city about enrollment, growth, choice, et cetera, et cetera. There's currently a survey going out, and I actually don't know if it's already closed, so we'll make sure.
No, it's into early June, if I remember
perfect.
right.
Okay, so everybody who's listening and is a parent or a community member, please fill out that survey. I need to do it too. So this will hold me accountable because this podcast will go out and I need to do the survey. Then phase 2 will be, and then there's also school leader engagement. So principals, I'm sure will have strong opinions about this as well. So the first is like more internal, and then survey and community meetings. And I would say the community meeting that we attended was a little bit more of a webinar style where we were just being talked at, and there wasn't much opportunity for dialogue among the participants on the Zoom. So hopefully with the community meetings in person, that will change. Then there is going to be a little pause in the summer, and then going into fall, there will be board member community meetings, district meetings, and then the goal, I think, is in October for the superintendent to make a final decision, which I think is some people said that that's more than they thought we would get, but I actually do think that's still pretty rushed because nobody's paying attention in the summer. We go back in late August, and then we basically have a month and a half, and then a decision is made. So I understand. That being said, I understand why the timing is the way that it is in order to get ahead of the next choice and enrollment window going into the school year 2027, 2028.
Exactly.
I
Right.
can't believe we're almost in 2030. I feel so old. Okay. So I'm sure there's more nuance and context. I'm just looking at the slides. Again, kudos to the entire team over there. Declining birth rates. There's also information about, last thing. I was surprised that they shared this data. So again, appreciate the transparency. 43% of DPS students attend a school outside of their boundary or enrollment zone. So which means 43% of students are choicing out of their designated school, which I found really fascinating. And the staff acknowledged choice isn't going away.
And well, but yeah, and let me
Law.
set a little context
Yeah.
there. Right. Exactly. In 1990, the state implemented a law that mandates that there's open school choice in Colorado. And what that means is school districts have a perfect right to draw boundary areas, and that students who live in that boundary get preference to go to that school, as Alexis described a minute ago. But if I'm going to use the extreme example on purpose. If I live in central Denver, but there's a really cool school in Durango where I want my kid to go to, if I want to put my kid on a plane every day, or I want to like go to Durango for the week and come home for the weekends or whatever, if there's space available in that school in Durango, I can send my kid there. In a lot of other cities, especially in the East and Northeast, there are school zones where your kid goes and you can't get your kid out of that school without extraordinary effort. So Colorado's choice law really opens things up for parents in a ways that limits how much districts can do to do things like integrate schools, because parents have the option to choice out and decide, especially if you live on the west side, well, hell, I'll just go to Jeffco then, or if you live in the south, I'll just go to Cherry Creek, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. And we see that in Southeast Denver, that if you are far enough in Southeast Denver, you do have parents choicing into Cherry Creek, or Holly Hill is another school. I don't know. I think that's Cherry Creek. Again.
That's Cherry Creek. We can now call it scandal-plagued Cherry Creek School District.
Yes, where Denver Public Schools, we are no longer alone in critique and political headlines about our superintendent, and
Right.
yeah, many of the districts around here are. Aurora is pretty safe though, so Aurora, keep doing what you're doing. What else? I think that's it. Again, we can like get more in the weeds, but Alan, would love your reaction to the board meeting, but I would love for you to just spend to the community meeting, but then have you just share some of your historic knowledge that I just wish more people would know about, because if you haven't been in Denver a long time, you likely don't know these stories.
Yeah, it was an information-rich meeting. I thought they did a good job of presenting it. Just one little side note that I found really interesting, and this is not on Andrew or anybody else, it was in the written documents, but they referred to the era of busing in Denver, which was from the early 70s until 1995. They called it forced busing. And I've been around long enough to remember that using the term forced busing had a super negative connotation, right? It's saying we're being forced to send our kids to integrated schools when we just want to stay in our neighborhoods. That was the term back in the day, forced busing, that was used by the conservative anti-busing crowd led by people like long time ago city councilmen, and I think even school board members, Ted Hackworth and Bob Kreider, who were the Southwest Denver, very white working class, we don't want our kids bused people. So to hear the district using some term that was absolutely a no-no back then, because it was kind of hijacked by the Republicans and the anti-busing crowd, was really interesting to me. That's just like in the lexicon now. It's weird. It just really struck me. But that's neither here nor there. I think one of the things I just want to say about this is that, having watched DPS for a really long time, the district historically has manipulated community processes to get a preordained desired outcome that they want, right? So I don't know if that's going to happen in this case, but I would actually make the argument, it's sort of the same as with school closures, that there are some decisions that are just really hard and that are going to piss off a large number of your constituents, no matter how you go. And so once in a while, you just have to suck it up as an administrator or an elected official and make the hard calls. So doing a community process is great. Getting community input is great. But at the end of the day, you can't be driven by the community on something like this, because the community is going to very much be split because they have different interests at play. So ultimately, somebody's going to be unhappy no matter what they do, and they're just going to have to be brave about it.
And that's exactly right. And Alan, I'm going to interrupt you for a second. What I do find interesting, and I referenced this at the start, this is the superintendent's decision. And I did forget to set the context of EL 19. So per Executive Limitation 19, which is one of the board's policies, it is the superintendent that will make the final decision on the final redrawing of the boundaries, if boundaries are redrawn. So they have to review them every 5 years, I believe is what EL 19 says. And I'll go back and
5 years. It's every 5. I'm looking at it right now. It's every 5 years.
Okay. And doing that because every 10 years we have the census data. And so wanting to make sure that in between a census, we're adjusting things accordingly. So that was a decision of the previous board, of which some board members, actually, do you remember what year EL 19 passed? Oh, I forgot to look that up before the podcast recording.
Last year.
Okay.
June 12th, 2025.
Oh, so about a year ago. So that was a previous board. I would be curious if this current iteration of the board would have given that power to the superintendent, or would have written it in a way where they were responsible for doing that. And the reason I ask that, the reason I'm curious about that is the district boundaries, meaning the school board boundaries, are set by the board, but the school boundaries, not the voting boundaries, are set by the superintendent, which is just, I don't know, a little strange. I can see the argument both ways. So it'll be interesting, the board. What I understand is that the board members, several of them were caught off guard, that there was an email that went out to parents about this whole process, and a lot of board members.
The survey.
Yep, and the survey, and a lot of board members getting calls from constituents and people within the district.
And they hadn't even known the survey had gone out, the board members.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah.
Well, the board members that I think we talked to, or talked to people who talked to them. Maybe some board members that I have not talked to every board member.
Right. Fair enough.
Okay. All right. Alan, I would love for you to share the East Manual story. That I think is a really interesting one.
Right. Well, let me kind of broaden it a little bit. Yep. And sorry if I go on for a long time here, and feel free to interrupt anytime.
Story time.
So I was working, I had just started covering DPS for the Denver Post way back in 1995, when U.S. Federal District Court Judge Richard Mage handed down an order ending busing, saying that the school district had basically corrected past wrongs, and the district could no longer be subject to busing required by, notice I'm not saying forced busing, required by federal mandate, court mandate to bus for integration. This put the school board in a really interesting, challenging situation where they had to redraw boundaries, because the way busing worked, and I'm not going to go into great detail here, but it was mostly, not exclusively, but mostly busing from northeast to southeast and southeast to northeast, because that's where the largest, it was really mostly, this order was really primarily about Black students and white students, and Black students being isolated.
Meanwhile, in 1995, I was in a school, CMS, where it was probably like 95% Latino students and 5% Vietnamese students. So it's just interesting that, and I don't know if our school experienced busing, but I didn't experience busing when I was there, but I was also very young, from 92 to 95.
Yeah, I think there definitely were some schools in the Northwest, like Cheltenham was bused to somewhere down
south as well.
Yeah, there was some. So like Cheltenham and Samuels, is my memory, is huge distance apart from each other, because Samuels is way down in far southeast Denver.
Wow.
Yeah, that's my memory, is that there was those two schools that were paired. But the way it basically worked was that schools were paired, and like for elementary schools, I think Steele down here where I live was paired with Crofton which is no longer even exists, but it's where a university prep school is now, up in 5 Points essentially, or Curtis Park. And they would have like all the K2 students from both areas would be at Steele, and then the 3-5 students would all be up at Crofton. So if you lived in the Steel neighborhood, your kid would stay home for K2, but then be bused up for 3-5 to Crofton, and that's how it worked. And again, it was mostly black-white schools is how it worked. So suddenly the district was faced with this. What do? We could either decide that the primary interest here is to continue to be as integrated as we can in a segregated city, or we could decide that we need to go back to neighborhood schools and stop all this busing and let kids go to school near where they live. You would think, no, you wouldn't think anything necessarily, but I might have thought back then that the biggest outcry for returning to neighborhood schools would come from white families. And at that time, the white percentage in the district was somewhat smaller. There was definitely white fled out of the district during busing. But I found during the school board meetings when I sat in, and I don't know how many dozens of work sessions between the fall of 95 and the spring of 96, when they went into the wee hours of the morning discussing this in a little tiny conference room at the old headquarters at 900 Grand Street. They were under so much pressure, the school board at the time, to go back to neighborhood schools. And it did not just come from white affluent families. There were very strong pushes from the Black Ministerial Alliance and other advocacy groups for the Black community. We want our schools back. Our kids have been bused for too long. It's insulting for you to say our kids can't learn if they're in a segregated environment. Just give us a chance. And the same thing from certain Latino advocacy groups.
Absolutely.
To return to neighborhood schools. So that's the decision that was made, despite the fact that it was clearly going to resegregate the district. But it was a contentious, long process with and I think I may have said this on this podcast before, but one of the most memorable moments in this whole thing for me was when Sharon Bailey, who had been on the school board recently, she's now sadly deceased,
Rest
brought
in power, Sharon Bailey.
brought the much older and esteemed, I think, first Black, or at least Black woman school board member of DPS, Rachel Noel. There's now a school named after her, who was rather frail at the time, into the school board work session, or maybe it was a public comment, I don't remember, but Rachel Noel and Sharon said, don't you dare return to a system of neighborhood schools and resegregate this district after all the work we did. And Rachel Noel led the charge to try and integrate the schools even before busing.
The Noel resolution.
Yeah, the Noel resolution, exactly. And the board just, politely ignored her because they had already made up their mind because of the kind of pressure they'd been receiving from all over the place.
Now, was that Evie Dennis, or who was the superintendent at the time?
Irv Moskowitz was the superintendent at the time. I think he came after Evie, if I'm not mistaken. But the story that you asked me to tell, and then I think I can stop, but as they were trying to think about how to redraw boundaries, a lot of the focus was on elementary schools, but then there came to be this interesting conversation about how do you draw the boundary for Manual and East. And as you know, you may not know because not everybody is this nerdy as we are, but the boundary for Manual has essentially remained the same since 1995 when they did this redistricting. And it's like a collar, a necklace that goes kind of from northeast to north central Denver in the northern extreme boundary of the city and kind of dips down a ways. That's the Manual High School boundary. At the time that they drew that boundary, some people pointed out that they were going to be putting kids together in a school that were from rival gangs, and gangs were a bigger thing back then, I think, than they are now.
These were during the summers of violence in Denver.
That whole area, right? It was during that time. The one conservative, semi-conservative, and definitely Republican board member at the time, a guy named J.P. Hemming from Southwest Denver, said, "This is stupid." And then they had this east boundary that's pretty much like the east boundary of today. He said, if you want to have two truly integrated high schools here, you go to the northern boundary of the city and you take York Street, which turns into University farther south, and you draw the line straight down York Street right to where you hit where York runs into First Avenue / Spear at the corner of the Country Club where the big Whole Foods is, basically into Cherry Creek. Yeah. And he said all the kids who live west of York would go to Manual, and all the kids who live east of York would go to East. And
makes sense geographically speaking, and it would definitely integrate wealth,
both schools,
class, and race. Yeah.
Right. The rest of the board, he got laughed out of the room because it would have taken a very wealthy and powerful constituency, the Country Club neighborhood, although I would argue probably most of those kids go to Grayland or somewhere else.
Yeah,
but they would have wound up at manual, and they'd always historically been part of these. So JP Hemming got laughed out of the room, and that never went anywhere. I remember I wrote a story about it and it was on the front page of the Denver Post with the proposed map, because it was such an interesting idea, and they didn't take it seriously, because and that's the kind of political consideration that this board, or the superintendent, I guess, is going to run into as they draw these boundaries, is which powerful constituencies are you willing to piss off? And in an era of declining enrollment, if you piss off the people who have the resources to choose to just leave DPS and go to a private school or something, is that something you want to have happen? Or do you want to try and maximize keeping as many people in the district as possible, but deliberately continue a pattern of segregation and isolating certain schools in very challenged neighborhoods when you have the option not to do so? So it's just going to be really interesting to watch.
Thanks for sharing that, Alan. You mentioned that a lot of this is focused on elementary schools, but there will be high school boundaries that inevitably have to get redrawn as well. And it just makes me think they're going to have to figure out what that means for students who are already enrolled. My guess would be there would be some sort of like grandfather clause for a couple of years.
To be.
Yeah, otherwise you would have riots in the streets.
Right.
And then the other thing that's making me think about as we talk about elementary, middle, high is the feeder pattern. So somebody on the call made a comment about feeder patterns, and I can't remember exactly what was said. I hope that I think they're gonna post the recording, but there is, how do I say this? I'll just say it. Some people, and a friend of mine said this to me, and I was like, you're kind of being a conspiracy theorist. I don't think they're like going to be that sophisticated with this, as they're going to draw these boundaries in such a way that it strongly preferences certain feeder patterns to keep students in traditional neighborhood schools. And the reason I kind of called BS is like, we have choice. Like, they're not going to remove choice. But then, so that was like, I was kind of dismissing this friend that said this to me. But then the fact that that specific comment came up about feeder patterns, I was like, well, it kind of made me rethink things. And then I had asked a question about types of choice schools and if those are getting considered. And the answer wasn't that it was not being considered, but it was kind of like everything's on the table sort of thing, which leads me to the question and concern. And maybe now I'm being a conspiracy theorist, and I want to just be careful. This is just my opinion. This is not based in any fact. So I just want to make that very clear. Is if they use this as an opportunity, they being the superintendent and the leadership, to change choice-only schools or choice preferences, I do think there is a way to do it where it chips away at more integrated schools, because choice schools tend to be more integrated. I think there is an opportunity to actually use this as a way of rethinking the importance of choice and how to do choice equitably. And I'm just worried that depending on the values that the superintendent uses, beyond we want integration, like there are ways that you can change policies and choice preferences that could actually create less opportunities for a diverse set of schools. So I'm a little bit rambly there. And what I mean specifically is, if the DSST school that my child attends is no longer a choice-only school, but a boundary school, for example, then my chances of going to that school are severely limited. And if that's the case for all of the charter schools that I would consider for my child, being a Southeast parent, then, would that end up meaning that I'm more likely to be choice, or because I don't put my neighborhood school on that list of the top 5 schools, does that then mean that I may end up more likely at Hamilton, which is our neighborhood elementary school, which I don't want my child to go to? So again, I'm rambling, I'm speculating a lot. I don't have this based on any fact, but if everything's on the table, there are things that I personally, as a parent and based on my values, that I would want to protect.
I don't think the district would have the direct power to tell charter schools that they were now boundary schools, but I do think they would have the power to say, they are the way DPS's choice system has worked since the Boasberg years is that charter schools are included in the whole application process, so that you don't have, as
Oh,
a
I didn't.
parent,
Yeah,
you don't have to say,
it's one application.
this is my list of DPS schools, run schools that I want my kid to go to. And meanwhile, I have to go run around and apply to all these charters. The district, back in the Boasberg days when it was more friendly to charters, got all the charters into the choice system, so you can rank and choice, put a charter school. They could potentially take the charters out of that, I suppose, but it would be hard to, I think, just tell charters that you're now a boundary school. They could use that as leverage
I
to
think that's a good
pressure
point.
them.
You're right. Yeah. And I guess I didn't even think about that other option that you just listed, is because I've taken it for granted for so long, is that I just submit one application per kid. But if I had to do that, if I had to do what I just did a year and a half ago for my next middle schooler that's going into middle school, who's currently in elementary, that would be such a pain in the ass. Like,
Right. If you had to go and apply, I want to apply to DSST, I think I want to apply to Strive, or I want to apply to university prep, you have to do all those separately.
Exactly. I don't even have my shit together. I don't have my shit together enough to just deal with all this summer program, camps. I'm not the type A parent that would be good for.
Right. I think this always gets into the argument, and I don't want to go into this at great length, but about choice, which is that, and I think one of the challenging things about this whole process is that there are schools in parts of town that are low performing enough that the families that are there are either there because they simply have no ability to transport their child outside of the area. They work 3 jobs, they work nights, whatever, or they just don't have the information about how the school's performing, and their child isn't being well served. There are certainly arguments made by people who are against any kind of school choice, whether it be charters or moving kids out of neighborhoods, that you should just go to your neighborhood school. But I think that's really depriving parents of the opportunity to make a choice for what's best for their kids. And to say that because some families are so-called left behind in schools that are really struggling, if the most able to choose families move out, it's a backwards argument. It's the old crab in the bucket argument. Why would you deprive families of making a choice of what's best for their kids? Because it might potentially cause an issue for another family that can't move their kid out. You've got to just make those schools better somehow, rather than trying to keep people in them who don't want to be in them. And then I think another really big issue with this whole thing is going to be, and they mentioned this in the community meetings at length, is the challenges of transportation. For any kind of true equity to take place in a choice system, you have to be able to get kids to the schools that they choose they want to go to. And that gets very expensive the more extensive the choice system is and the transportation system is. But if you don't, it's just not realistic for a lot of families, as I mentioned a minute ago. One of the ideas I have that would be politically unpopular was the schools I mentioned earlier that are just highly concentrated with affluent white kids. Like I'll pick on Slavens because the most obvious one in Southeast Denver. What if if you really wanted to integrate these schools, what if you said 75% or 65% of the seats in this school are reserved for people who live in the boundary, and the other 35% are reserved for people who decide to choice in, and all those, and whoever choices in gets transportation to that school. But yeah, you tell that to the parents in the neighborhood around Slavens who spend $1 million+, maybe $2 million+ now, on a house in that neighborhood so they could send their kids to Slavens, and suddenly they're aced out of going to Slavens. It would be incredibly unpopular. But if you really want to try and integrate some of these white, heavy, concentrated schools, that would be a pretty direct solution to that, as far as I can tell.
The real estate lobbyists would be on the doors of DPS headquarters so fast. If that would be one way to increase community engagement, and lobbyists coming into the district is doing that. But I think that's a great idea. And you know me, I just like to be contrarian sometimes, and why not put out the thought-provoking and controversial thing as a starting point to react to? But what would it mean if we also just had fewer boundary schools, and including district schools? What if East, because it's such a flagship school, what if East didn't have a boundary? Again, parents would freak out, but it would at least spark a conversation about what do we value? What is equitable? Why, why do only families that are privileged enough to live within a certain boundary get guaranteed access to a school like East? Why can't, and then it opens the question of like, why can't all schools be as good as East, right?
East is pretty integrated, so it's not the best argument. East is actually one
Yeah.
of the more integrated schools, except until you walk into the classrooms inside the school.
Yeah,
That's where it's segregated.
yeah, there's unfortunately there's still very much like tracks, like ID tracks,
Right.
AP tracks at those schools. That's okay. That is a good point. And I think the other argument, what I just said, would be as we go further into the future, your chances of getting into one of your schools, assuming the choice process doesn't change, is going to increase because of declining enrollment. So if it was, 5 years ago and I had a incoming sixth grader, I think it would have been a lot harder for me to get into the school that my child got into than it was a year and a half ago. So I don't know. That could just be another argument of like, really, most families get at least their top 3 choices. But I also know families that really wanted to go to Slavens or really wanted to go to a DSST school and they just weren't able to. So they chose Remsel or they chose private or they chose out of district, which
Yeah.
again is privilege in and of itself.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Obviously, this is going to be a really fascinating process to watch once the new school year begins and it really kicks into high gear. So we will be monitoring it. We'll be having people on to talk about it, and we will be watching the community meetings and the process to see where the pressure points are and which ones seem to be effective. I'm guessing it's going to end up very much like it did in 1995 when I watched it last time, but I don't know. I think at the end of the day, despite the fact that there's a huge amount of evidence out there that integrated schools serve all kids well, that's going to fall by the wayside to a certain extent because it becomes so politically difficult. And there's this great New York Times podcast from a few years ago called Nice White Parents about a neighborhood in Brooklyn, New York, where they did integrate the school, and then the white parents decided that they were going to like really invest in the school, and they were so culturally insensitive that it just caused all sorts of problems. So there's so many issues involved in this, and it gets so fraught, and it really pits people's professed values against what they actually want for their own children, that it creates, I think, a lot of self-loathing in people when they realize they're hypocrites, and that at the end of the day, they'd rather have their kid in a school where they think they're being served well than an integrated school, and then it causes like lots of self-torment. It's really interesting stuff, and the stakes are super high for everybody, so it's going to be fascinating.
I totally agree, and I'll give a shout out to Teresa Pena, who at some point we have to have back on the podcast. I don't know if she coined the term, but I credit her for the term, is Denver nice. I think there's going to be a lot of Denver nice parents that we're going to see in these community meetings. And I think there were some on this call that we were just on Thursday night too. So they also have a voice, and those voices should be heard. Everybody should. But if the value is equity of integration, there's going to be some really difficult conversations that need to happen.
Yep. All right. Well, we only went 45 minutes or so that's not too bad. But yeah, that was a good conversation, and we would love to hear your thoughts about this as it goes forward. And if you have any ideas about other ways and other angles to approach with it, we will do that. But thank you, everybody. We will be back soon with another podcast. I'm actually going to be out of the country for a couple of weeks at the beginning of June till the middle of June, so we may have a little hiatus there, but don't worry. It doesn't mean we've died or gone away. It just means there's a little pause happening. And we will talk to you again soon. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Alexis.
Bye, everyone.